Hey, Carly.
Hey, Stephen.
Well, I once made the mistake of saying yes to everything at Chipotle. You know the drill. They ask you if you want beans, rice, guac, salsa, and before you know it, you've created a burrito the size of a newborn. It was like trying to eat a small overstuffed pillow. Every bite sent rice flying and guacamole oozing out of the sides. It was delicious, but it was also disgusting. And so by the end, I had this mess that looked more like modern art than lunch. Because it turns out just because you can add everything doesn't mean you should. Prioritization, Carly, is the art of knowing when to say enough.
You know what I love about that is that's so relatable, Stephen. We all have done that, I think, at least. But I'm sure we can all relate in our own jobs and work of when we've said yes to too many things. And now our to-do list is so long and it doesn't feel like we have any priorities and we don't even know what the goals are and what those priorities fall under and what the strategy is. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We have the president and CEO of Dunham and Company, which is an agency that works in the nonprofit industry and has a lot of experience consulting with nonprofits around this exact thing, specifically like working with organizations and coming up with future strategy. So hopefully we can help answer that question and our listeners will not be getting oversized stuffed burritos in their future.
Well, enough introing. Let's get into the lab. Welcome to the Responsive Lab, your new favorite podcast where innovation and impact come together to transform the nonprofit world.
Brought to you by Virtuous, a software company committed to helping nonprofits grow generosity.
At Virtuous, we believe that generosity has the power to create profound change, both in the world and in the heart of the giver.
Learn more about Virtuous and download your free nonprofit CRM checklist at virtuous.org/checklist.
So welcome to the Responsive Lab. Today, we are joined by Trent Dunham, the president, CEO, and benevolent dictator of Dunham and Company. We're so excited to have you here, Trent. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. That's good. So I've been in the CEO role at Dunham and Company for a couple of years, 2.5 years now. Our organization has been around for a little over 20 years, and I've had the privilege of serving within it during that whole duration, that whole time. I'm a college football fan. I enjoy golf now because my son is totally into golf, and so I caught that bug along with him. I have a wife who I've been married to for almost 25 years. And 3 kids, the first of which I'm dropping off at college in a mere 2 days. And so my emotional state may be questionable at this point.
Well, then you're in the right industry because I think nonprofits thrive on having an unstable emotional state to thrive and succeed. At least that's the rumor I hear. So how did you get into the world of fundraising?
That's a good question. I grew up in the church and as a result wanted to be a pastor when I grew up. And it was just a thing that was kind of in my world. One thing led to another. I was actually a youth pastor for 2 years out of college. And then it was clear that was not the vocation that I would be most successful in. And at that point, my dad was leading another agency as president and co-owner of it. And so I joined that at the entry level, take notes, run this production schedule, move this project through, but kind of caught the bug of being able to deploy my talents from a ministry standpoint into business. And so what happened was the opportunity to serve a lot of different nonprofits with really awesome causes really resonated with me as a person. And so one thing led to another. My dad dissolved that partnership, started a different company, which is now Dunham and Company, has been since over the last 21 years. I joined him almost right away. And so it was 2 of us sitting in a Regis suite looking across a desk at each other like, what do we do now? And so since then, we have grown to a little over 50 employees here in the U.S. and then another dozen in our Australian office just outside of Sydney, Australia. Serve our Asian Pacific clients out of that office and privileged to serve the organizations we get to serve. And we do that primarily at Dunham & Company through strategic consultation around fundraising, marketing, media, and creative. So a lot of brand strategy work in our world too, which are all things that nonprofits need in varying degrees. And so that's where we get to spend our time and what I love doing.
Well, you set yourself up there like a pro, because our first topic of the day is macro trends in philanthropy, which is a very fancy way of saying, tell us what are the big ideas that you're dealing with in the nonprofit world right now.
Yeah, that's good. Nonprofit world is certainly it's a challenging season for nonprofits in general. And the reason I say that is because from a fundraising perspective, the economy having been what it is, kind of the lagging effects of inflation on donor bases far and wide have created challenges for organizations in the nonprofit sector. From acquiring donors has become more difficult than ever. Retaining donors has become more difficult. Converting one-time donors to a second gift has become more difficult. There's a lot of more difficulties in our world. And so especially as it relates to our conversation today, there's things that can help through really wise investment in technology, in automations and personalization that can help create a system that isn't overly reliant on manual processes, but also allows people to experience the benefits of the organization, what they do, what the organization does for its end user, and how a donor can be involved in that through their giving in much more meaningful ways, I think. So some of the things in our landscape is just a lot of organizations are wrestling with, how do I integrate AI into the work that we do to communicate effectively what we're doing? And so there's a lot of things like that, I think, that are operating at a higher level that people are wrestling with. How do I distinguish myself or charity in the marketplace when it comes to all these things? And how do we stand out? They're tried and true kind of timeless challenges that organizations have faced throughout the years, but they seem to be kind of the dashboards. The red lights are flashing a little brighter than they have in the past in a number of areas, not the least of which the several I've mentioned.
From working in a nonprofit, I can definitely agree with that. My question to you is, how do you see, like, what is it that the barriers are that nonprofits run into? Because I feel like in the nonprofit space, we kind of just talk about these issues all the time, and we don't always talk about like how to get over them. We're just like, oh yeah, donor retention, it's down, and it's always a struggle. Like, what do you see from an organizational standpoint that like a nonprofit can't seem to get past to overcome these trends you're seeing?
Yeah, I'll answer your question maybe a different way than anticipated, but I think oftentimes what happens is we get so wrapped up in the way we've always done things, and then we see this mountain of challenges and we don't know how to see clear from it. So we just start doing a bunch of stuff. And, doing things is important. We need the train needs to be moving forward, but oftentimes we put the focus in the wrong places. And I believe that's a result of not stopping down and having a clear discussion on what are the priorities of the organization to reach the goals we've defined as success. So a lot of times, it's just pretty baffling the number of organizations I talk to where actually success has not been clearly defined. What do we say? How would we say that we have been successful if we're looking 12 months on from now and assessing how those 12 months went? How would we say it was effective, it was successful? A lot of organizations couldn't tell you that. And so I think that's the first place you have to start, because then it drives what do you do to achieve those objectives, and how do you then align the activities along those prioritizations to make sure those things are getting done. So it's, if those are maladies in the organization, acquisition, conversion, whatever it might be, retention, then is there a plan to address those? Or are we just doing activities that we think might work, but actually we're not going to implement a strategy long term? And I think that we see that more often than not.
And what keeps a nonprofit from actually prioritizing?
Well, I think it is, I'm saying one thing that I think most organizations deal with, and then another that maybe is a little counterintuitive or maybe something we don't address all the time. So I think the main reason why organizations don't address prioritization issues is because maybe there's silos within the organization. I see this a lot in nonprofits where there's just silos between marketing or fundraising or brand, who's ever managing those things. And there's not real collaborative clarity on how are we going to achieve those objectives together within our specific departments. And so working together oftentimes inhibits the effective working together inhibits us really implementing processes and strategies, the tactics that support those strategies effectively. But I think one of the things that leadership, now I'm just going to speak to leadership in general, so not an entire entity, but the way that leaders inhibit prioritization for their organizations, I call it the shiny object syndrome. Or you might think of it as the person who's the strategy shifter. So oftentimes a leader will say, hey, these are objectives we need to go meet. This is how we're going to go about doing it. And then they read an article 3 weeks later and it changes their strategy. Oh, we're going to actually attack it this way. And then they meet with a person 4 weeks later and it changes the strategy again. Well, your people never get any momentum. They're not able to implement exactly what is going to help solve the problem and actually test it, measure it, change it. And so I think one of the things that leaders can do well is really define for the team, this is the objective we're going for. This is how we're going to go attack it. And we're going to see this strategy through. It doesn't mean you don't make modifications along the way as you know, new things are introduced in the marketplace, shifting landscape, those kind of things. But the leader can, I think, really provide the team with strength to do what they're called to do by being really clear on what the end objective is and then working a plan towards it.
You know, this idea of prioritization and leadership, something that I've experienced professionally, both in for-profit and nonprofit, is that having clearly defined priorities that the whole team buys into gives you a basis upon which to say yes or no to any given idea. Because a lot of times what happens, especially when leadership isn't involved in the creation of those priorities, is that they'll come in and be like, hey, let's really focus on this thing. And that thing is number 8 on the list, let's say. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, we have other priorities. And the sense is that, well, because it's number 8, and again, they may not be using that language, but in theory, they're saying because it's number 8, it's not important. And the reality is that if the team and leadership are on the same page about those priorities, everyone can agree that number 8 is important, but that number 7 is more important. And that's not an insult to number 8. And so when you talk about changing as the year goes on, if the team can rally around the leader who says, actually, because of these reasons, we need to move 8 up to number 1, then a team can move in harmony. But when you skip that step, like you just said, a lot of teams don't even know what success looks like a year from now. Well, then you're creating chaos and not clarity. Do you see that? Do you witness that on teams?
Yeah, and I think that's the main reason why teams get frustrated. You know, there's a frustration level inside the organization. I feel like the things I'm doing are successful. Like I can put numbers behind how it's working, but actually when it doesn't ladder up to the corporate objectives effectively, then is it really going to get noticed, or is my effort actually going towards the thing that's going to produce the outcome that we really want to see produced? I do think that leaders are wise to communicate effectively. And what I mean by that is, are you pulling your team together on a frequent basis to assess? Because yes, it allows us to know where number 8 and number 7 sit in rank order. But the other thing it does is it provides clarity for accountability. So I can hold you accountable to performance related to priorities 1 through 3 because we said they're the most important. But if I haven't defined those as priorities 1 through 3, then what am I actually holding you accountable to? My preference in how you do things? My preference in what I think will help achieve the objectives? Or is it really something more material than that, is less subjective and more objective?
I think there are invisible people listening to this conversation, nodding their head, saying, yes, I've seen that. I feel that. I've been there.
Yeah.
I think one of the other issues that I've seen in the nonprofit space is even if you prioritize, not everyone can execute on it. Like a lot of big ideas, especially from leaders, but then not a lot of people with like the tenacity and understanding of how to strategically execute. Since you work with so many nonprofits, what do you see from that perspective?
Yeah. And I think that's where outside counselor help is oftentimes the most beneficial. It's kind of short, like every organization has a certain set of skill sets internally that are very strong. It's different for every organization. And then they have areas of weakness, just like any organization would do, for profit, nonprofit, any is, hey, we're really strong in these areas. We don't really know how to do those other things, or we have people to do those, but they're not really advanced in their career yet, or skilled in those areas. So it's really doing an inventory and saying, where do we fit based on, and that's why I love having those meetings where we define what success is. We develop the priorities to help achieve that success, and then we just do an honest evaluation. Hey, what is the internal skill set of the organization in the ability to execute these things, and where are the gaps? And then who are going to be your partners to help fill the gaps to ensure that does happen. Sometimes that's a strategic hire. Sometimes it's a partnership through an outsourced solution, an agency, or someone who's skilled in that particular area. Maybe they have a platform that works for whatever you're trying to develop or implement. And I think that's an important discernment on the leader's part, is what needs to be augmented within our organization to really effectively drive this forward, or do I have the internal skill set and talent that already resides here to do it?
Just a small little anecdote. Sometimes having an outside voice just helps. I ran my own business for 20 years, and I can't tell you how many times I advised my business partner on some ideas and be like, yeah, it's a good idea, but then we never do it. And then a third party would enter the room and make the same suggestions. And he'd look at me and be like, that's a good idea. Why aren't we thinking about it that way? Sometimes having that outside party just gives you a fresh perspective. That's true in business.
Right.
Sometimes it's true in friendship and marriage and everything. Sometimes you just need someone else to look at you and say, what does success look like a year from now? And you have to answer the question honestly.
Yep.
So we've talked about execution. We talked about the shiny object syndrome. And I think there is a Venn diagram that layers over, and right in the middle is, how do you scale? How do you use technology? Because there's lots of technology. Some of it's great, some of it's bad, but all of it's useless if you don't know how to apply it, and if you don't apply it wisely.
Correct.
So let's talk about this idea of how to scale and what role technology plays in that.
Yeah. Man, this is oftentimes the difference between real growth organizationally and just kind of doing what you've always done, and maybe kind of just maintaining the level of growth that you've had historically. It can be a total game changer. And I think what's important is that too often, I think, we look at systems before we look at processes, before we look at the strategic objectives. And so we're like, hey, in order to grow, we need this system. Well, you haven't said anything about what the system is going to do, or what it's going to serve, or the processes it's going to enhance, or the outcomes that it's going to enable. And I think rather than starting with the system itself, that's where the challenge is. It's a little harder sometimes to define the strategy. And then it's even sometimes a little harder to say, what are our processes to achieve that? And then you can get to the system, the platform that's going to help enable that. And so getting the sequence correct for how you determine what is the right technological tech stack or specific platform that's going to help enable things is really important. So you don't start with the tech, but that the tech supports exactly what you're going to do. And that order, I think, is really important, that organizations get flipped too often.
Yeah, well, Carly and I work at a technology company, and I think we can attest that there are times when a customer comes on board and they haven't done this work, and they're not ready. And in their minds, Virtuous was that shiny object that was going to solve problems for them. But in reality, leadership needs to define the problems that need to be solved, because that then drives what solutions and systems make sense. And you also go through a sales process as a nonprofit with smarter questions, because you're looking for answers versus just show me where it's the shiniest.
Yeah. And I think that's the challenge oftentimes, is that whether it be a partner or consultant or an agency or a tech stack that becomes the solution. That's not a solution. Those are things that help enable us to achieve the objectives we've laid out, but only in the right context, as you mentioned, Stephen. Only in the right framework can those things really be accelerants. But having said all that, if you've defined the strategy well, if you know the process that you need to implement in order to get to those things, or if you know the way in which you go about doing development or fundraising or whatever, communications or whatever it is, if you don't take that extra final step of implementing the right system to support it and to make it scalable, you will not grow. You can't, because there are limitations within your human capacity and with archaic systems that limit the ability to be more customer focused, more donor centric in the way that you do your work. And so I think you can't just stop at that and say that we've defined the objectives, we have the processes in place, and not really considered or reconsidered, even if you do have a current tech stack that's maybe several years old, that maybe isn't serving you the way it could if it was optimized, or if it was the right set of tech for you. That is an important hurdle bridge that you do have to cross in order to be optimized.
That's super interesting, and I can relate to that a lot. The other thing I want to ask you about is, a lot of times someone lower in the organization sees the need for technology, and they have to kind of lead up to convince leadership that it's time to switch, or even just to change a fundraising strategy. But that can be really difficult for a variety of reasons that I won't throw people under the bus for. But how do you suggest that someone in a fundraising role can lead up, whether they are trying to convince their leader that they need new technology, or again, they need to change their fundraising process or something like that?
That's good. So the thing that I think frustrates leaders the most is when you get problems without solutions. When you have people that come to you with problems constantly but never provide a solution, it can be frustrating. It's like, am I the answer man or the answer woman for everything that you bring to me? And so I think leading up, one of the strengths of someone who really leads up well is that you bring solutions with the challenges. I think you can't be afraid to present the challenges. Hey, I'm seeing this area of opportunity. We're not as good. We're not at an industry benchmark in this way, or we're inefficient in the way that we address this with our donors, or we're actually getting complaints around these things, the ways that we communicate with, or whatever it might be with our donor base. Instead of just logging the complaint and making hey, flag, I put something in the complaint box, but actually bringing the solution with it, that's the first step. So what kind of solutions? Hey, I saw this problem. There's a couple things I've seen in the industry that might help us in this. Some of those require budget, some less budget. I'm thinking through, maybe here are 2 or 3 options that we might consider around a conversation for this. I think that's step one in leading up effectively. Is a leader is always going to feel more equipped to help you figure out the problem when they have options to play with. So even if it's a single option, it's still an option. I can either tell you, no, we don't have the money to invest there, we're not going to do that. Or I can say, well, that's really actually a good idea. I think we should move forward with that. Let's test that, or whatever it might be. So I think that's step one in leading up. I think the second thing in leading up is do research. Help your leader understand how other organizations are addressing issues or handling challenging situations in the industry of like types of organizations. I noticed that I talked to people at these organizations and they're handling it this way. It might be something we want to look at. Those, I think, enable the leader to make decisions on, you're at a fork in the road, we go this way or that way, rather than saying, here's a problem, can you figure out for me and in some ways do my job for me? And I think that's where you get probably more ground taken with the leader, when you're able to present solutions and options and research that help them make an informed decision more rapidly.
Trent, this podcast is for free. It's unbelievable what you just distributed to the minds of the listeners. Thank you. Some really great wisdom in there. I really like this idea of leading up, coming with solutions to consider. Even personally, that's that makes a lot of sense. I've appreciated receiving that type of thing, and I have also appreciated giving that type of feedback to a leader. But we have now reached the portion of our podcast that Carly calls the mystery question. So this is the final portion of the podcast, and It has almost nothing to do with fundraising, and it is all to do with the three of us answering a question honestly.
I love it.
It is themed around prioritization. And the question is, if you had to prioritize one meal to eat for the rest of your life, so you have to prioritize, would it be breakfast, lunch, or dinner? And why?
Well, I mean, I'm wholly unprepared to answer the question of this complexity, but I'll give it my best shot. And I can tell you right now that if I had a fantastic lunch every day, I'm a happy man. Breakfast, sometimes I'm just not in the mood for breakfast. And dinner's great. But sometimes, with kids and run into different programs and stuff, dinner just gets super late. But if you've got a really healthy, filling, spot on lunch.
That's a good answer. Unfortunately, it's the wrong answer. Carly, your turn. Let's see.
I actually was convinced by that answer, but I'll go with my original one, which was dinner. Because usually I'm like, I don't always eat breakfast, or I'm too busy doing something else in the morning. And I'd rather go to bed feeling satisfied than feeling like, oh, I'm really hungry and I can't wait until tomorrow.
See, Trent, I hope you were listening, because that was the correct answer. Dinner. Dinner for certain. No, I'm just kidding. But yes, dinner is also my answer. For the primary reason, probably because my kids don't do a lot of sports or after school activities. I just think of dinner as it's a very communal, we're all together at a table, or if I go out with friends, it's kind of after this, I'm done for the day. I love a good lunch, but I know after lunch, there's still so much ahead of me. There's still a lot to do.
I get that.
It's a great way to figure out how people look at their day by asking them this very simple question. But Trent, we appreciate you carving time out of your busy schedule, and we especially appreciate the wisdom with which you so freely shared with us today. We're really appreciative of you, of your time, and everything that you're doing for our sector.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The Responsive Lab. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a review. Your feedback helps us continue to bring you the best content, and we'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and join the discussion. We love talking all things generosity and technology, and this podcast is fueled by Virtuous, the responsive fundraising platform that works for you. Virtuous is a great example of using technology to scale your fundraising and personal relationships with your donors. To learn more, visit virtuous.org/learn more. Until next time, keep experimenting, keep innovating, and most importantly, keep making a difference. We'll see you back in the lab soon.